Do you hear me? All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to talk to you about Shahnameh. So I never miss a chance to talk about Shahnameh, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you. So almost all the faces are new to me, except Maro and Faribors. I'm glad to see you guys here as well. And I hope that some other new faces come as well and join us. And the rest of you, I'll be happy to know you more. So thanks so much, Mr. Mirza, for uh, having the course last week and talking to the audience about Shahnameh. I watched the recording. It was great. It was a very good introduction, and also there were good discussions at the end. And I'm sure that those who did not know what Shahnameh was about already have some good background. So I'm going to talk more about Shahnameh in general and some history and background today as well. And as part of that, I may also challenge a few of the things that were discussed last time. And the reason for that is that the fact is that the Shahnameh has been written over 1,000 years ago. So, and there are a lot of rumors, stories, legends around the life of Ferdowsi himself. And that's a fact. Sorry, can you just give me 1 second? I'll be back. All right, I'm really sorry. Sorry about. I wanted to get my phone. I usually record sessions for myself, so I listen to it and just learn from my mistakes. So as you can tell, my English is not perfect, so I'm going to review what I say and try to do better next time. So yeah, I was telling you that there are a lot of stories and legends around Ferdowsi's life, but none of them is proven. And it's really hard to know the real story of Ferdowsi based on all of these stories around his life. However, there are a few of them that can be easily refuted and proven wrong, like, for example, the stories around his interaction with Sultan Mahmud Ghazni. So I'm going to talk more about that today as well. And I hope that I can shed some light on that part of Ferdowsi's life. But basically, with that introduction, I want to just basically clarify that what I'm going to share with you over the next 4 lectures might be a bit at odds with what you already know of have learned over the years. And first of all, I apologize in advance. So if that's the case, and second, we should accept the fact that we cannot tell the fact or find the truth about some of the aspects of either Shahnameh or Ferdowsi because of these 1,000 years. The oldest Shahnameh manuscript that we have today is from 200 years after Ferdowsi's death. So who knows what happened to this book throughout these 200 years. So that's the reason that some of what I might share with you is different from what you already know. And I try to talk based on the researches that done by the scholars. Many of them, or almost all of them, are Iranians, because obviously Shahnameh is a Persian book, and a lot of research done in universities and other places on Shahnameh by Persian scholars and university professors. And I read their books, I listen to their lectures, and that's where my point of view come from. And if you ask for references, I may give you a couple of references in English, but unfortunately, most of my references are in Persian language, which are not necessarily translated into English. So I hope that you accept that from me. If you want to read Shahnameh, there are a few translations. One that is recommended by most these days is by Dr. D. Davis, the professor of Ohio State University. Even though the main problem I have with that book is that it's not complete. He has not translated many parts of Shahnameh. So I was looking at it yesterday, and it talks about Khosrow and his disappearance at the end of his reign, and then he jumps into Rostam and Esfandiar. But we have a lot of stories in between, so that's not translated by him. So that's one of the gaps that we need to maybe fill in other places. One of the things I'm going to do in this lecture is that I'm going to review the Shahnameh for you. I'm going to start from the beginning all the way to the end and tell you the main stories. I'm going to tell you where it starts and where it ends. Because one of the specific characteristics of Shahnameh is that it's talking about many, many generations of people. That's unique, especially according to Dr. Davis himself. When you compare that to the European literature, when you compare that to Iliad and Odyssey and some other famous books from the West, that's completely at odds with it. So that's completely different, because they mainly talk about one generation, a group of people who have been in interaction with each other. However, in Shahnameh, we are talking about 50 kings, 47 kings, 3 queens, throughout years, over the ages, who knows how long. And that makes it unique. And the other interesting aspect of this is that all of these kings are chained together. There is no gap in between. So when he talks about one specific king, for example, in Sasanian era, that king still refers to Feridun and Jamshid, and it's as if all of them are known to everybody, and they know that, okay, so these were our ancestors. Even Iskandar, Alexander, I heard about some of the discussions around this Alexander last time. So even Alexander is turned to become Iranian, half Iranian in Shahnameh. They made it part of this chain, which is pretty interesting. It's claimed that Alexander is the son of Darab, who is an Iranian king. So when Alexander came and overthrew Dara, they said, oh, so it was just brother to brother war, and then one brother was defeated by the other one. So this is the interesting characteristic of Shahnameh that I hope that you enjoy. And I'm going to tell you as much as I can about this. Of course, it's a pretty large book and I cannot cover all, but I'm going to tell you about the notable stories, and I'm going to connect them for you and try to tell you the meanings of some of them as well. But I'm not going to start from there. I'm going to start from the history and the background. But before that, so as Mr. Mirza mentioned, I've been working on Shahnameh over the past 25 years, even though it's not my main job. I'm a software engineer. This is not my field, so I'm not a scholar. All I do is that I just learn about others and just narrate. So I apologize if there's any mistake, even though if what I say, as I mentioned, so is different from what you know, it might be a mistake. It might be a different perspective, and yours might be as valid as well. However, so over the past many years, this is the first time I'm doing this in English. And this is a big challenge. First challenge is obviously my English skills are limited. But the second and more important is that we're talking about a Persian book. And it's not just a Persian book, it's a Persian masterpiece. Shahnameh is beautiful. Every single word of Shahnameh, you need to enjoy it. You need to listen or read and say, wow, what a masterpiece. But how can we talk about that without reading Shahnameh? So I know that some of you know the language, So at least one person I know is Iranian. So definitely know. Some others might know some words, but I would like to still read a few verses of Shahnameh for you. I cannot skip that part because I know that the words of Shahnameh mean a lot. And even if you do not understand it, I think you sense it. Let me just give you an example. So one of the most famous verses of Shahnameh are these two lines, saying that the houses that are the dwellings of today will sink beneath shower and sunshine to decay. But the storm and rain shall never mar the palace that I have built with my poetry. See, beautiful words, very strong and very deep meaning. And this is where Ferdowsi talks about himself and what he has built. And he truly praises that. However, listen to it in Persian. بناهای آباد گردد خراب ز باران و از تابش آفتاب پیافکندم از نظم کاخی بلند که از باد و باران نیابد گزند. You feel it, right? It's strong. It's very powerful. It's very beautiful, melodic. So that's what I'm going to do in this course. When I talk about some specific lines of Shahnameh, I read them for you in Persian as well. And I try to translate it myself. Unfortunately, when I looked around, I did not find any translation in English which has the line-by-line translation. So if you know of one, please send it to me. However, if not, I'm trying to translate it myself, and that may not be obviously accurate, but I try to convey the meaning. All right. So let's talk about the Ferdowsi's life very briefly. So Mr. Mirza covered it very well, but I'm going to talk about a few things that are important in his life, and then I'm going to continue with the references and sources of his narration. Ferdowsi was born in 940 CE. So it's almost 3 or 4 centuries after Arabs attacked Iran and conquered the land. So this is an important fact to know. So by this time, all these fights and military conflicts have been subsided. So Iranians kind of had given up on regaining the power and becoming independent. They were still under caliphate in Baghdad, but they decided that they want to fight using their culture, so their civilization and the rich culture that they have, and they try to revive it. And Ferdowsi was one of the people who tried this. He was part of the Dehqan family. I heard that there was a conversation about that as well the last time, and it was absolutely correct. Dehqan today means farmer in Persian language, but that's not the meaning that it was back then. Dehqans were landowners, people who were wealthy, were the noble families. However, they also had a mission, and their mission was to preserve their culture, the Iranian and Persian culture, which is rich, and it was known throughout the world back then. But Arabs had convinced many Iranians and many people from other places that there was nothing before Islam. And that was something that these guys were trying to fight. They were trying to show that, no, we have a rich culture and we have a lot of background which comes from thousands of years of civilization, from big empires and all of that that you know about. And I'm going to talk a bit briefly about that as well. So Ferdowsi was part of those families. And so from youth, he believed that he should do something. And then he talks about it when he starts his book. I'll talk about that. However, what was Ferdowsi's name? Does anybody know?
Yeah, Abul Qasim al-Mansuri or something.
Abul Qasim was one of his names. It was not his first name. I'm asking about his first name. It was one of his, what do you call it? This is one of the English words that I now skipped my mind. But anyway, one of the things that he was known as. However, his first name was Mansur,
Mansur.
or maybe Hassan, or maybe Ahmad. What was his father's name? Hassan, or maybe Ahmad, or Ali, or Ishaq. All of these names are written in books. We don't know what was his first name. This is that ignorant we are about his life. We do not even know what his name was. So it's just one example for us to accept the fact that we may never know the true life of Ferdowsi. However, there are things that we can tell for sure. Like, for example, his name as Ferdowsi, what we know him as such today. But how can we be sure? Because he himself said it in Shahnameh. And only once and only once, there is a story of Goshtasp. And in that story is where Ferdowsi starts to quote Daghiri. I know you now know about Daghiri because Mr. Mirza talked about it last time. So Daghiri, the person who started Shahnameh before him, and he wrote 1,000 verses on that story, the story of Goshtasp and Arjasp and the war between Turan and Iran. So before Ferdowsi starts narrating him, he says why he did so. And as part of that, he talks about his dream. چون این دید گوینده یک شب به خواب که یک جام می داشتی چون گلاب دقیقی ز جایی پدید آمدی در آن جام می داستان ها زدی به فردوسی آواز دادی که می مخور جز برآیین کاووس کی. I had a dream one night in which I was drinking wine. He was drinking a lot of wine, by the way. So Daghiri appeared in my dream and said to me, Ferdowsi, don't drink except in the manner of King Kavus. So he says that Daghiri told me Ferdowsi. He called me that such. So this is the only place that we hear his name. So his name was Ferdowsi. We know that, and a lot of other references that call him as such. So then Ferdowsi started Shahnameh and devoted 30 years or more of his life to writing this masterpiece, which is now about 50,000 lines of poetry. And each line has 22 syllables, which is slightly longer than what we know in the heroic couplets in the Western poetry. So according to Dr. Davis, for an English reader, we can we can think of Shahnameh as being about 100,000 lines because the lines are bigger. So that's how you can sense that this is already a big book and a lot of stuff in it and a lot of changes throughout the years, by the way. So there were some conversations about that. I'm going to talk a lot more about it in the next lectures. However, so one question we might ask ourselves is that what was Ferdowsi's legacy? What was his mission? There was some conversations about that as well last time. But what is his legacy? According to Dr. Mojtaba Meinavi, one of the famous scholars of Shahnameh, there were three things that we should appreciate Ferdowsi for. The first thing is obviously what everybody talks about, reviving the Persian language. Or I don't want to call it reviving, I want to go to preserving. Persian language was spoken back then. It was known. It's not like, for example, Ferdowsi decided to speak or write in a language that nobody knew. No, everybody knew. So people knew, but this was not the official language in some aspects of people's life. For example, it was not official language for science or for court, basically for documents. And even in the course of Samanids, which is the which were the kings that during the Ferdowsi time. I'm going to talk about that more too. So they were speaking Persian in their court as well. So Persian language was spoken, was known, but it was being replaced slowly by Arabic. And Ferdowsi preserved that, not single-handedly. I cannot claim that. There were other reasons. There were other main reasons for that, for survival of Persian language. And some of them, believe it or not, is even thanks to Sultan Mahmud. Not to him, but to his vizier. So his minister, who ordered the official language of the court for all the documents to be converted from Arabic to Persian language. And that was very important. And that was when people tried to learn that language and study language because they wanted jobs. They wanted to be able to work with all of these documents and whatever that was needed. So that's one big other reason for survival of Persian language. However, Ferdowsi had a big role. I'll tell you a bit more about why, how he achieved that. This is important, how he achieved that. But before telling you that, which is kind of related to the third legacy of Ferdowsi, the second one is about setting a high standard and high quality bar for Persian poetry. So let me put some context for you. So the year that Ferdowsi was born was 940. This was the year that the Rudaki, who's considered the father of Persian poetry, died. That means that Persian poetry was in its infancy at that time. Ferdowsi's time is before all of these giants of Persian poetry: Sadi, Hafez, Rumi, Nizami, Khayyam. All of these were after Ferdowsi. But Ferdowsi put such a standard, put a high bar for them, and they were learning from him. And if anybody wants to think about beautiful Persian poetry, they refer to Ferdowsi. And that's why nobody dared to write anything less and claim to be a great poet. And as I said, so language barrier, unfortunately, does not help. Let me tell you about all of these little details of the beauty in his words. However, I'll do my best in some of the next lectures to talk about some of the aspects of that, why we think that Ferdowsi's words are beautiful. I'll talk about that. But let's move on to the third legacy of Ferdowsi, and that is about the content of Shahnameh. What is in Shahnameh? We all know. So a common interpretation of that is that Shahnameh is full of stories. Yes, Shahnameh is a storybook. But is the legacy of Ferdowsi storytelling? What matters is that what kind of stories are we talking about here? These stories are the stories of Iran's past. And that's make it special. Ferdowsi talks about the mythical and to some extent even the real history of Iran in Shahnameh. Ferdowsi starts his book from the beginning. I hear that some people say that from the creation. It's not quite right. Ferdowsi starts from Q-Mars. Q-Mars, as we know it in Avesta, is the first man. It's not even a man, it's just a prototype of a man. So obviously is the beginning of creation. However, Ferdowsi did not say it as such. Ferdowsi says Q-Mars was the first person who sat on a throne. He was the first king. So, but there are some interpretations about that. People believe that maybe Ferdowsi was smart, so he knew that if he talks about Q-Mars as the first man, this is based on basically the creation story, the Persian or Iranian creation story, which is in conflict with whatever it was back then and whatever we hear from Quran and other Islamic sources. Maybe he could not make it that obvious. So that's one of the aspects. But there's more into that, and I'm going to talk about that later. However, so we need to learn more about this history and the sources of Ferdowsi to know why these stories are important, very important to people. So for that, let me first talk about the concepts that I introduced here. Myth, or people talk about legend as well. Legend and myth have some differences. However, we sometimes use them interchangeably. So, but technically what we're talking about here is a myth, is not necessarily legend, even though some parts of Shahnameh is actually legend, because legend usually refers to real people. Stories, maybe fictional stories, but usually behind the real people. And at the end of Shahnameh, when Ferdowsi talks about Sassanians, these are real people. And some of the stories were also real. Some of them were not real, they're fake. So maybe that part we can consider as legend. But the beginning of Shahnameh, when he talks about even imaginary beings, that part is certainly myth. And myths, so there's a better word for myth. I don't know why we use myth in English. There is a word that we use it in Persian, comes from Arabic word osture. And that comes from a Greek word, historia. And that is the best word to use. Historia is the root of two words, history and a story. And this is exactly what this is. History as a story, or stories that come from history. So what does that mean? It means that these are stories that have roots in ancient times. There are stories that we cannot simply say, oh, come on, this is a story. Somebody just imagined that and wrote that. That's just fiction. But osture, historia, or let's call it myth now, is different. We cannot simply say that these are imaginary. These stories have roots. Roots in, first, one thing is roots in beliefs and faith of people, and is very tightly connected to people's religions. And the second thing is that myths may be connected to some real events in the past, that people over time interpreted those and reimagined those events as such stories. Let me just give you two examples. Again, these are not things that can be proven, but some people believe in that. There are some scholars like Mr. Feridun Junaidi is one of those famous scholars in Iran these days that interpret all of these stories. For example, he says that 1,000 years of Zahak's reign, which was dark times, maybe it was not obviously about a single king, a serpent king who ruled 1,000 years. That's nonsense. However, that could be a long period of hardship. 1,000 is a big number. This might have been a long period of hardship in people's lives, which could have been due to bad kings, bad rulers, or could have been simply to natural disasters like droughts. And over time, that was reimagined as a bad king ruling Iran. Or in the story of 7 trials of Rostam, when Rostam goes to Mazandaran to rescue King Kavus. In his journey, he goes and fights the white demon. Think about it. So he's going to Mazandaran. Many people take Mazandaran as the place called Mazandaran today, which may not quite be the one. So the Mazandaran might have been in the east, even not even in the north of Iran. However, if we imagine that as such, some believe that white demon is the Mount Alborz, is the big mountain on the way of going to Mazandaran. And people needed to basically fight that, needed to somehow be able to just pass that to be able to go to Mazandaran. And that was reimagined as white demon. It just a huge demon that you need to fight to be able to just go and rescue Kavus. So again, these are interpretations. There are many more. The story of Ferdun and his 3 sons. Ferdun divides the world among his 3 sons. One of them is given the west, one the east, and one, Iraj, the third one, is given the center, which is Iran. Remember that always Iran is the center in the Iranian legend. In every single nation's myth, their nation, their country is the center. That's the fact of life. So everybody believes that, okay, we are the center, right? So, but now they say that maybe these were not 3 sons. They were 3 groups of people. Some migrated to the west, some migrated to the east, and some settled in the center, in the middle. And then these different groups fought each other over the years, over the time. And that has been turned into the story of Ferdun and his 3 sons. So that's why when we hear these stories, there might have been some roots in reality. There might be something behind them that we may appreciate. We may try to understand, even though we never understand it fully, but we need to appreciate that and not simply just put it aside. That's why this is studied. Mythology is the science of, or the field of studying these myths. So one other aspect of mythology is that it usually talks about the beliefs of people. And it talks about also imaginary things. And also it talks about gods and demons. And it talks about superpower. And it talks about the beginning, about creation. So myths usually talk about this. And we see that as well in Shahnameh. Because the stories of Shahnameh are the stories of coming from the myths and usture. All right. So, but now, so I want to talk about also the sources of Shahnameh. But before that, let me tell you about the history of Iran a bit and where the people of Iran come from. And then we study their myths. So obviously we have had indigenous people in Iran. And there were evidence that they lived in Iran's plateau as early as maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And Elamites, we know about them, for example, they were around maybe 3,200 years ago, or 3,200 BC, they lived in southwest of Iran. And we also have we've seen evidence from civilizations from southeastern of Iran, even older than that, maybe 5,600 years ago. But with the people of Iran that we know of today, mainly we believe that they come from the north. Obviously, they had some clashes with the indigenous people. And many of these stories, believe it or not, come from that era. So the story of Div or demons, many believe that these are the story of those migrants as they referred to the native people of Iran, who had different faces. They were darker, they were larger, and they considered them as demons. Again, these are just guesses, but these are one of the examples of having some meaning and roots behind these stories. So, yeah, people of the north, they were called Aryans, Aryai. They lived in the north of Iran, south of Russia. And about 5,000 years ago, some of them were looked for warmer lands. They migrated to Europe, and they are the ancestors of Europeans there. And some of them came a bit south, and they lived together for over 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years. And then around 3,500 years ago, they divided. And some of them came to Iran, the Iranian plateau, and lived there, and they are the Iranians. And some of them migrated to the east and settled in India. So these people are called Indo-Iranians. So the languages they speak are coming from the Indo-Iranian languages. And then they are part of a bigger family that are called Indo-European. So the people who, the Aryans are the Indo-European people, people who now live from Europe all the way to India. How do we know that? There are two reasons that we believe these people lived together in the past. One is language. There are common words, common phrases, common grammar between these languages. So you know what the words, for example, mother, brother, father, daughter, all of these words are common. You see them in European language, you see them in Indian languages, in the Persian language, right? They come from the same source. And when you look at, for example, Avestan, the language of Avesta, and Sanskrit, these languages are so close that some believe that they are not even two different languages. They are dialects of the same language. They're very close. But there is another reason that we believe these people have the common ancestors, and that is their legends, their stories, their myths. What you see in Iranian myths, like, for example, Shahnameh, many of those stories you see in the stories of Indians. You see Mahabharata, Ramayana. You see them there. For example, Jamshid, as I think was mentioned last time, Jamshid is also Yama, the king of death, in the Indian myth. We also see similar stories in the European mythology. So it's interesting. I don't think I have time to give you examples of that, but Zeus, for example, the story of Zeus is very similar to the story of Ferdowsi. There are similarities. I had a talk about that. So so this is one of the things I really wish we could translate. I have several lectures on each one of these topics that are unfortunately in Persian language. So I try to summarize some of them for you here in this class. But if you have any question about those, I'll try to answer them. All right, let's talk about, so obviously, you know about the Iranian empires, the Persian empires, you know, the Achaemenids, you know about the Parthians or Arsacids, which are Ashkanian, and then Sasanians. These are the big empires and dynasties before Islam. And after that, you know about the rest of them, all the way to Ferdowsi's time and all the way to today's time. So I don't want to talk much about them, but what I want to tell you about is about the sources of Ferdowsi's stories. This is very important for us to know. I cannot emphasize how important they are, because many believe, for some reason, they have such wrong notion that Ferdowsi made up those stories. That's not the case. Ferdowsi was telling his stories of the past, and he had references. And that's another thing that I need to clarify for you. I don't know, maybe today or not next time. Mr. Mirza, how long more do you want me to talk?
Yeah, as long as you like. We have allocated an hour. So if you wish to take any questions, etc., in a little while, that'll be great. And then a quiz if possible.
Okay, sure. So maybe 10 more minutes and then I'll wrap up and then I'll answer questions. All right. So the source of Iranian myths, the main source of it is Avesta. Some are even surprised by that. Some believe that, oh, Avesta is just a few Niayesh, there are some prayers and there are words of Zarathustra. All of these are true to some extent, but this is not all Avesta is. Avesta, even people believe that Avesta had been a huge book in the past. It was written on 12,000 cow skins with golden I don't know, ink. There are some references about that. So there are at least 3 different sources. One of them is Dinkard, the other one is Abu Rayhan, Biruni, and then Tarikh Tabari history. All of these telling us about these 12,000 skins of cows with Avesta written on it. And these are the ones that were destroyed by Alexander. So, however, what it means is that Avesta was a big book, but we don't have all of it. We have a small portion of it today. So the part that we have today is divided into 5 different sections: Yasna, Yashts, Visprad, Vandidad, and Khord Avesta, or Little Avesta. Right? So each one of these parts of Avesta have their own content and their own basically objective. But from our perspective, some of them are much more valuable than others. Yasna is the part that has Gatha, the words of Zarathustra in it, right? But in Gatha, you do not see much of these stories. So there are just 2 exceptions. One is that Zarathustra talks about, by the way, so I call it Zarathustra, Zoroaster, Zarathustra, I don't know different names we can call him, but Zarathustra is the one that I'm comfortable with. It's just a Persian one. So let's use that. So Zarathustra talks about Jamshid very briefly, very, very briefly. He talks about a sin that he made. That's it. And even the sin that he refers to is different from the sin that other sources believe that Jamshid has done. But let's put that aside. He talks about Gushtasp Kiani. And that is important because Gushtasp is coming from a dynasty, the Kianian dynasty, that we have no evidence of whatsoever today. But just the fact that Zarathustra talked about him, so make us believe that he existed. And at least a few of these kings from that dynasty most probably were real. And these are some of the kings that are in Shahnameh. Kianians are in Shahnameh. They start from Keyqubad all the way to Dara. They are considered Kianian dynasty after Pishtadian. I'll talk about them more in the next lectures. So, but Gatha is a part of Yasna. Yasna has some references into some of these myths, some of these stories, but however, is not that rich from that perspective. Visprad also does not have much, or maybe even nothing at all, about these stories. Visprad is just some prayers that are used usually by Muvads. So I know that there are some experts here, so I don't want to preach to the choir. So Khord Avesta as well, same thing. They're prayers for common people. So there's not much references to those stories. Vandidad is an important one. Vandidad is very interesting, even though today we believe that Vandidad is not quite what aligned with what Zarathustra wanted to say. So there's some nonsense in there, to be honest, right? And many Zoroastrians, I don't know if not all, but many Zoroastrians believe that this is not part of our religion. So let's put that aside. However, it's important from the myth perspective. There are important stories. The story of Jamshid and some other stories are in there that are important to study. But the last part that I want to mention from Avesta is the most important one, Yashts. Yashts are full of these stories. There are a lot of stories that you see them in Shahnameh. If you want to look for the sources, you can look at the Yasht. We have 2 types of Yash, the old one and the new one. Some believe that even the old Yash are even older than Zarathustra himself. Those were stories that were turned into basically Zoroastrian Zoroastrian flavor. Maybe there were some gods that were turned into Yazatas and Izats, right? But their stories come from the past. So the story of, for example, Zahak, Feridun, and all the many other kings who did sacrifices towards gods. Now they say that towards Ardovisur Anahit. So but that kind of sacrificing 1,000 cows and 10,000 sheep and things like that, these are not part of our religion. So where did they come from? These came from those beliefs from ancient past that were reflected in Avesta. And then throughout times, they changed all the way to the point that they reached in Ferdowsi's hand. and he narrated those stories. So besides Avesta, we also have some Middle Persian texts, which are also rich references for us. And Middle Persian, or Pahlavi, we call that language, right? So there are two famous books, Dinkard and Bundehesht, right? These books are also very important, and they have the story. Bundehesht is the primal creation book. It talks about the creation, and many of the stories that you see in Shahnameh are in Bundehesht. One of the important aspects of these books are that they are believed, especially Dinkard, are believed that they're interpretations of Avesta. Parts of Avesta that we do not have today. As I told you, the big part of Avesta was lost throughout times. But maybe we have some of that in those books. So that's why they might be even more ancient than just the Sasanian era, or even some of them are written even in the early Islamic era. But they are talking about ancient sources, and they are important from that aspect. We also have some books, especially two important ones, which are from the Parthian era. Deracht Asurik, the Asurik tree, and Ayategar Zariran, Yadegar Zariran. This is the book that is kind of the main reference for Daqiqi. The story that Daqiqi narrates is the story that you see in Yadegar Zariran. So I think it's now clear that the stories that Ferdowsi narrated have roots. And these roots were, at some point, were gathered, were collected, were written as maybe a single book or a series of books. We call them Khodainameh. Khoda today means God in Persian language. However, Khoda at that time meant king. Khodainameh, Nameh means letter or book. Khodainameh is Shahnameh, the book of kings. And these were the books that were written during the Sasanian era. They started from the time of perhaps Khosrow I, Anushirvan, all the way to Yazgir III. They were written and rewritten, and they were added to it over time. So these books were telling those stories, which at that point, at that time, they believed that they were history. Then let's not talk about them as history stories anymore. They believed that they were history. We think that the notion of demons is ridiculous today. However, back then they believed they existed. Even if the story had demons in it, they say, oh, remember at some point in the past, there were a demon that did that. They were telling history. The oral history, which turned into written history at some point. And then, obviously after Islam, many of these were lost. Khodainamehs were scattered. However, Mobats especially preserved some of that. And it was during the 4th century, or 5th century, maybe. So that there was one man who decided to gather these stories again and translate them. It was Abu Mansur, Abdul Razzaq. He was the ruler of Khorasan. He ordered his Wazir, his minister, Abu Mansur al-Muammari, to go and find some Mubats who had these stories. There are 4 of them that we know their name today, and they were named in the introduction of that book. The introduction to Shahnameh, that Shahnameh, which was the name of that book that was created. It was prose form, but it was created to translate these stories, or Khodainamehs, into Persian language. And we know that book as Shahnameh of Abu Mansur. And that is a very important book. Why? Because that was the reference of Ferdowsi. Many scholars today believe that this book was the sole reference of Ferdowsi. This is very important. So I hear that people say that Ferdowsi was hearing stories from people and narrating them. There were oral stories that he wrote. Many scholars today believe that that's not the case. Ferdowsi just converted this book into poetry. And of course, added a lot of wisdom, a lot of fascinating words and interpretations into it. However, this was the reference. Ferdowsi himself in the introduction of his book talks about this. I don't want to touch on that today. I'm going to briefly talk about what Ferdowsi says about his reference in Shahnameh next time. However, I just want to tell you that this is an important book that was created by the order of Abu Mansur Abdul Razzaq and written by Mubats. Some interesting fact is that there's an introduction to this book that is the only part of it that survived today. You know why? And that is the introduction. That introduction survived is the only part that survived, thanks to Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. Why? Because throughout the years, people for some reason believed that this introduction is the introduction of Ferdowsi Shahnameh. And they saved that. They wrote it in the beginning of Ferdowsi Shahnameh. So until a point that Allama Ghazvini, one of the Iranian scholars, discovered that actually this is not Ferdowsi's Shahnameh's introduction. This is the introduction to Shahnameh of Abu Mansur. And this piece in prose form is very valuable today for two reasons. One is that it tells the story of how this book was created. He names these four Mobats that came from various parts of Khorasan and Sistan, and they wrote this book. And the second reason that is important is that it's the oldest Persian text that we have today. This book was written in 957. Ferdowsi was 17-year-old when this book was created. The story of Ferdowsi, how he used that book, how he found it, and how he narrated it, I'm going to leave for next lecture. And I'm going to talk about Sultan Mahmud and Ferdowsi as well next time. But until then, just believe me that the story of Sultan Mahmud and Ferdowsi that you know is not the truth. At least based on what I heard last time. I'm going to tell you that story next time. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. And I'll be happy to answer your questions. But before that, just one caveat. I hope that you are okay if I tell you that I don't answer some of the questions, because I'm going to talk more about them in the next lectures. So please focus on just whatever I told you now. If you want to ask, for example, about the Achaemenid Empire, why they are not in Shahnameh and things like that, which are not part of what I discussed today. So I'm going to talk about them later. But feel free to ask your questions. And I see that there are some questions in the chat already. So let me look at them briefly. English translation by Dr. Surati prose. Thank you. So great. So I'll be glad to find this book, the translation. Alexander Roger as a line by line translation. Great. So yeah, I'll be happy to see this book too. I don't know where I can find it. And yeah, wow, lots of references. Great. Thank you guys. So I'll try to find those. If you know, for example, on Amazon or somewhere that I can order them, please let me know. Okay, so this also said that today's facts become tomorrow's myths. Interesting, yeah. Zarathustra calls Jamshid as Vivang Ho. Okay, good. And what were the names of the four Mobaz in the introduction of Shahnameh, Khudainameh? So I do not know them by heart, but let me, if you really want to know that, let me just search them for you quickly and just tell you those names. All right, so here are the names. One of them is Shaj, the son of Khorasani from Hari. Hari means Herat. Yazdandad, the son of Shapur from Sistan. Mahuy Khorshid, the son of Bahram from Neyshabur. And Shazan, the son of Barzin from Tus. So we know the name of these four Moabites, the name of their fathers, and where they come from. This is that accurate because it's reflected in the introduction of Shahnameh Abu Mansur. Okay, so I'll be happy to hear your voices. Oh, Bahram, Pastakia.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I wanted to commend you on this beautiful lecture.
Thank you.
And your concern about your English is not properly placed. You speak beautifully and you're in complete control of the language and delivery. It was very, very enlightening and very thankful for that.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm glad
Now, the reason I wanted to talk is I want to dial back a little bit a few years ago, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had a recording in Farsi of the Shahnameh and your daughter translated it into English in her American accent or Canadian accent.
Yes.
And that DVD was on sale at one of the North American Zoroastrian Congresses.
Yes.
That was a labor of love. And I want to thank you for doing that. And I was wondering, in those days, probably there was no internet and all this stuff. We were still struggling with DVDs.
Mm.
Do we still have that access? Because I could see that as a beautiful resource. In North America, at least, when the Zoroastrians are going to the religious classes, they drive half an hour, 45 minutes, 1 hour in their cars, and that could be played. And listen to the story of the Shahnameh in Farsi and translated into English, which would be a great source of education. So any updates on that?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we have these audiobooks on Amazon, on Google Play, on iTunes. They are there. I send you this Amazon link, for example. So if you search my name, you find them. And this might be the Persian version that you see, which is narrated by me. And let me search my daughter's one. Yeah, these are the English versions by my daughter. So we had basically just 3 of these audiobooks that you can find in digital form, obviously, these as well. One thing that I need to mention is that so they are just very small part of Shahnameh. So if we wanted to finish that, it would have been maybe over 20 books, 20 audiobooks or more. However, this is a good start. So we started from the beginning and we narrated the stories from the beginning all the way to, I think, to Kavus. And the fourth book has been in production for years. Unfortunately, my daughter was studying for college and all of that, so we could not finish that. I hope that someday we finish the fourth one at least. So also there's another book another work that I think what might be interesting for kids especially is the stories of Shahnameh that I created for kids, and that is an ongoing project. So there are 3 books already out, and the 4th one should be out in perhaps in less than a month. So those books are specific for especially written for kids, and they are just some of the stories which are absolutely non-violent and they are very kids friendly. So they're beautiful stories with, I think, interesting drawings. I basically commissioned an illustrator to just create that. So this is another link. You can see these are the 3 books that you can find. on Amazon as well. So this is for,
Thank you.
obviously for very small kids. All right, thank you so much. So Maro.
Good to see you, Afshin.
Good to see you
Thank you
too.
very much. I know your passion comes out as always. I mean, I know you're very passionate about this and I appreciate it. I think you brought history right in front of our eyes. And we always think of Shahnameh as stories, right? With myths and mythology. But I think you made a very clear case today that it has its roots in our history. And I'm looking forward to the subsequent lectures from you. Afshin, there was last year, I believe I reached out to you about that book, which is available, which we also is also displayed at the fires in Houston with Aban Rustamji. The books, is that the same book that we are talking about? And
You need to remind me a bit more.
I will send that to you because I
let's talk
remember
about that.
there was a book and I know the CDs. Afshin and Nusha in, I think it was in the LA Congress in LA that they presented this CD and it was,
that was the
and
first
I would
time the first book.
recommend,
Yeah.
I would recommend that to everybody. I mean, the pictures and the stories are just very, very interesting and very good for the children. So
Thank you.
Afshin,
Thank you so much, Maro. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I also need to tell you about these audiobooks. When we started that, my daughter was 9 years old. And when we finally put the first audiobook in production, she was 10. So what voice you hear is just a 10-year-old voice, and obviously it was her own translation of my words in Persian. So I wanted this to be her work, and that's meant for kids as well. But I think that's as good for adults as well. Those stories we try to cover the actual stories from Shahnameh. Some of them might be a bit violent, so might not be for 5 or 6 year old, but maybe 10, 11 years old, especially these days, kids see all these kind of crazy things. So I don't think that is important. All right. Thank you. Jeru, Karishma, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Afshin, for your very beautiful description of the Shahnameh, and Ferdowsi to see as well. I want to know if you can remember anything about it. When I was a child, I'm 84 now, but when I was a child of about, say, 8 or 9, and we had our religious classes, somewhere, whether I had heard or I had read, it was so well impressed upon me that Prophet Muhammad wanted to become a Zoroastrian, a Zartoshti, but he was not allowed. So he burnt 16 chapters, first 16 chapters of our Avesta. Is that correct? Or of our religious books? 16 chapters he burnt.
16 chapters of whose book?
Avesta. I don't know whether it was Avesta Pelvi or Avesta, some Avesta write-ups he burnt up. And so we have lost those 16 chapters, in which Bamanyas used to be there also.
So it is a fact that we lost a lot of Avesta throughout the ages, and due to all of these attacks throughout the years. We started with Alexander, and then we had Arabs, and then we had the Mongols and Turks, and so we lost a lot. So there were basically ceremonies in which they burned books. There were cases where they asked people that if you want to live, you need to bring books for us to burn. So that's how horrible that those days were, and how much they wanted to destroy Iran's past. So, and I don't know about that story. Unfortunately, there are so many stories. There's no evidence these days. And I don't think that you need to rely on that. But the fact that we lost a lot of parts of Avesta and a lot of other books that we had. So we had big libraries that no longer exist. So all of these are true facts and very unfortunate, very sad.
Mohammedanism would never have come into being. Muslim religion would never have come into being had Muhammad been allowed to become a Zoroastrian. For what reason was he not allowed to become a Zoroastrian? At that time, there was no Mohammedan religion.
Yeah,
it was only after he became a prophet that, I mean, he was declared a prophet that people started becoming Muslims. Same as Zarathustra.
Yeah, this is the first time I'm hearing, to be honest, and I don't want to rely on that. So again, stories exist, a lot of stories, but this is very unlikely, in my opinion.
Doesn't Ferdowsi say anything about it?
Absolutely not. He has even some lines that he praises Muhammad. He says that I'm Muslim. So some of these lines are in doubt. Some people believe that that's not from him, but we cannot prove that. Again, remember that the oldest Shahnameh is from 200 years after Ferdowsi. We have no evidence of what happened throughout during these times, but I won't be surprised if Ferdowsi was a Muslim. So back then, many Iranians were Muslim. However, what we can say for sure is that Ferdowsi did not show any sign of Islamic beliefs in Shahnameh. Shahnameh is purely about Iran's pre-Islamic era. And everything that is in it is much more aligned with what we have in Avesta, in Zoroastrian beliefs, than in Islamic beliefs. So he either was so close to the Zoroastrian beliefs, or he was a hidden Zoroastrian in disguise, who knows?
Was he a Zoroastrian?
I'm sorry?
Was Ferdowsi to see a Zoroastrian?
That's what I'm explaining. So based on what we have in Shahnameh today, Ferdowsi was a Muslim. However, if we look at what he said in his book, we don't see any sign of Islamic beliefs in that. So
why is it so soft?
And basically, I can say that Ferdowsi's work was not a religious work. His mission, as I mentioned, was about reviving or preserving Iran's past, Iran's culture and civilization, but not the religion. It was not about religion. So that's why if we're going to talk about what religion he had, I know that people are curious. Some people make a big deal of it, but I don't think that that is something that we need to focus on. Let's focus on his words, which was about Iranian identity, not about necessarily about the religion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Manik, you're mute.
Yeah, one time at a lecture on Ferdowsi by a Muslim scholar at a university in California, the guy said that, Ferdowsi was not a closet Zoroastrian, as many people believe. And so then in my question answer session, I pointed out that, yeah, he may not have been a closet Zoroastrian, but he had a lot of respect for his Zoroastrian ancestor, and I pointed out the couplet which says, Magui ke atash parastan budand, parastandaye paka yazdan budand. So he was pointing out the wrong myth that is being circulated, that Zoroastrians are fire worshippers instead of God worshippers. So that he had to agree on that.
Yes, and one interesting fact also is that so many people believe that Ferdowsi was very shrewd, very smart in a way that he created this book, which was all about praising Iran's past pre-Islamic era during the time that Islam was the prevalent and it was in power. How could he do that? So some believe that Ferdowsi had to do a few things to basically make this book survive. One of these was that, okay, tell in the introduction that I'm Muslim, and I'm a devoted Muslim. So he should have written that. Otherwise, they already accuse him of being a Zoroastrian and praise the Zoroastrians already. So again, as part of a legend, is that he was not allowed to be buried in the Muslim cemetery because they believed that he was a Zoroastrian. See, so there were already things like that. So he had to write something about his own belief. That's one thing. The other thing is that the most sensitive part of Shahnameh, from that aspect, is the story of Zarathustra himself. And he did not narrate it from his own word. He said, oh, Daghighi said that. So this was basically maybe a political move by him. Otherwise, one of the things that is interesting is that after he quotes Daghighi and add these 1,000 lines in his book, at the end, he says that, okay, Daghighi was a great guy. He did all of these, but he was not a good poet. I do better.
Yeah.
So, and that's true. When we compare his words with Daghighi's words, see that his words are much more stronger and beautiful, right? So if that's the case, maybe you could have said, come on, I did for 50,000 lines, so I'll do 1,000 more and do it better myself. But he didn't. He quoted Daghighi. So if somebody says, oh, you're talking about Zarathustra and you're talking about his story, no, I did not. Daghighi did, right? So things like that, or the story of creation that he turned into the story of the first king, not first necessarily the first man, that might have been another. But one of the things also that I'm going to talk more about later is that some of these might not be even Ferdowsi's. As I mentioned, he had a reference. Maybe those Muvats or some others who maybe wrote those stories and those references, they were shrewd and they wanted to not be maybe harassed by Muslims. That is another.
Also, the poet Hafez, he was also smart like that, and he also was able to counter any criticism. But in his poetry, he also says that he tried to get answers to his questions in the Quran, but he couldn't find them. But he found them in the temple of the Mogan, the Zoroastrian priests. And so he was also very smart. But many of his books were also, he had to burn them because there was one time a mob that came to kill him, on that suspicion.
Yeah, so there was many stories like this, people being smart to preserve things. So, for example, the story of Shahnameh Suri. So it's one example. It's the last Wednesday night or Tuesday nights in of the Persian calendar these days, where people light fire, and then so we have some ceremony like that in Iran. They say that it comes from the pre-Islamic era. That's that one part, and that comes from that belief that people believe that basically the soul of the dead come back to visit their families for no rules, and they wanted to light fire and then just show them the path. But then when Islam came to Iran, they could not say that. They said, oh, it's just the last Wednesday of the year that we are celebrating, we're lighting fire. And then over the year, that became the new custom. So that might be one thing. Or when you mention about Hafez's book is full of references to wine and to the beloved. And now, these days, especially after the Iranian Revolution, people in books interpret that, oh, this is the God, and this is the divine wine and all of that, which may not happen. So Hafez was a human being, and he liked to have wine, and he had just earthly beloved, right? So, but you could have saved this, otherwise, oh, come on. And this is another fascinating thing about Shahnameh itself. So some people interpret Shahnameh in a very weird way. They say that the name Shahnameh, Shah means grand, means big, and Shahnameh book is a grand book. That's the meaning of that. Why did they say so? Because they did not want to say like Shah means king.
Mm.
So after the revolution, some people wanted to preserve this book and let it publish just by this trick. Saying, oh, Shahnameh is a grand book, so don't focus on the word Shah. But we know that Shahnameh is the story of kings, is the book of kings. All right, Maro. You're mute.
Yeah, so I was saying that what Geronti was mentioning, I had also heard that there was a man called Salmek Farsi who was a Zoroastrian, but he could not, I think he went into Manichaeism or something, and the priests said that he couldn't be a Zoroastrian, therefore, and they kicked him out. And apparently he was a tutor for Zarathustra. And also I'd heard that he allowed Muhammad to enter and conquer Iran during the battle with Rustam, because he knew certain passageways into Iran. That's what I had read.
This what you're saying is closer to the reality. Yes. So Salman Farsi. So his original name was Ruzbeh. He was a Zoroastrian. He went to Mecca and he met Muhammad, and he helped him. And some people believe that he wrote some of the Quran. So there's no proof on that. But yeah, and also he helped the. They say, so this is again is not proven, but they say that okay, he helped the Islamic army to find fastest way to Iran and things like that. But I don't know how much of this is true, but this is at least something that I've heard of. Thank you. So let me just give you some quizzes. It seems that we need to ask some questions, right? So let me start by this. So do we know Ferdowsi's first name?
No, we don't.
No, we don't. Right? So do you remember some of the names I gave?
Hassan.
Hassan, Ahmad,
Abu
Mansur.
Qasim.
Ahmad.
Yeah.
Ali?
What?
Qasim.
Abu Qasim.
No, Abul Qasim is, yeah, so one word we here, and that's, again, it was just not his first name, but Abul Qasim, Abu means usually father. Abul Qasim is father of Qasim. That means
I think you said
his son's
you
name
said-
was Qasim.
I think you said Mansoor, right?
Mansur.
Yeah,
Ahmed.
Mansoor. So
Ahmed.
Mansoor, Hassan, Ahmad, these are the names. Mansoor is the one that is referenced in the translation of Shahnameh to Arabic. So this is one of the books that are very important. So somebody named Bondari of Isfahan, Bondari Isfahani, this guy translated Shahnameh to Arabic, and we have this book today. And in the introduction of that, he says that the name of Ferdowsi was Mansoor. So this book is important. I'll talk about that. So I'll talk about the Shahnameh editing and things like that in the future lectures. And I'm going to talk about this book too. All right. So why are we sure that Ferdowsi's name as we know today, which is Ferdowsi, is actually true? I mean, what's his name?
Because he said so
He said so. Where?
in his book.
When?
In the introduction, he talks about it.
No, it's not in the introduction.
Okay, you tell us.
He referred to himself as Ferdowsi in one of the couplets.
Yes, but where is it? It's important that where this line is. I told you about it.
In the story of Gushtat.
There you go. In the introduction of the story of Gushtas, and right before quoting Daghili's 1,000 lines. Right before that, he talks about the dream that he had in which Dariri came and talked to him, and he referred to him as Ferdowsi. Yes. Okay, so can someone tell me what are the 3 legacies of Ferdowsi, according to Dr. Mushtaba Meinavi?
To preserve the language, the Persian language.
Yes.
That's one.
To set the bar really high for the other poets.
Yes. Yeah, so bar for Persian poetry, beautiful Persian poetry. Yes. And third one?
It's the history.
And narrating the stories of the past, the history of Iran. Yes. So it's interesting to know that there are other history books that are written which have these stories in more or less similar to what we have in Shahnameh. But these are the history books for historians. Ferdowsi wrote history for the common people. And now, yeah, I wanted to talk about that as well. But very briefly, this is one reason that the Persian language survived, because people loved to hear these stories and read these stories. And as a result of that, they preserved this book and they learned it. Many of you, I'm surprised to see that many Parsis have verses of Shahnameh in memory. I can't believe that. I applaud you guys for this. It's amazing. So, and that's what happened throughout the years. People remembered, they memorized all of these lines because they loved this. They thought that this is their history. They wanted to know that. They wanted to tell it to others. So, and that's why these legacies are all connected. The language is preserved because the stories were in Shahnameh, and because it was beautiful, and because it was just in poetry, and people could memorize that, and they enjoyed listening to it or reading. Okay, so I told you that some of these myths have some roots in the past. Some people believe that there are references to some real events. For example, 1,000 years of Zahak. What is the belief around that?
The dark ages of Iran. Maybe the ruler or there were some calamities in Iran that made it difficult for people to live.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and then when Feridun came and overthrew Zahak, maybe there was a time that there was some good change that happened. So maybe there was rain that now ended the droughts, or it was maybe a good ruler that overthrew a bad ruler, whatever that was. There was something. So I'm going to talk a bit more about this in the later lectures. There are some interesting reasons for why myths are created. There are 3 different reasons for that. I hope that I have time to talk about that too. All right, so what are the, why do we believe that Iranians, Indians, and Europeans have had common ancestors?
Language.
Because the language, the many words are almost the same.
Yes. 2 things.
Even the belief in the
Language and
mythology.
Mythology, yes. So yeah, we have evidence in language, common words in languages, and also common myths.
Right.
Which give us this evidence that actually these people have had common ancestors. Yeah, that's great. All right, that was it. Thank you so much. And there's one more question here. I see that the book that I mentioned, give more details. Oh, Mark, this is a question for you. And so just like the Ramayana, Mahabharata is known for worldwide, I'm wondering how famous or which other culture actually read and know about our Shahnameh. I'm wondering if these stories are referred within and among the Kurds and the Muslims. The Kurds and Muslims, if you talk about Iranians, absolutely. Absolutely. So Iranians, regardless of their religions, they love Shahnameh.
Okay.
You can't imagine how devoted people are to Shahnameh, especially these days. So over the past few decades, especially, people are looking for Shahnameh. I know that because I'm in this business. I see that people come to me, talk to me, want to learn more they attend my classes, and I see that there are many other classes that they attend to. There are lectures, there are seminars, there are books that are written every day on Shahnameh. So that just in Iran, yeah, absolutely. People love it. Outside Iran, I don't know how known they are. So even in the, yeah, so there are some references to people outside Iran from other languages that know Shahnameh, but unfortunately not as much. So that's sad. But people who know Shahnameh, they love Shahnameh. Those who read that believe that Shahnameh is, I think I read that quote somewhere, that Shahnameh is the biggest unknown masterpiece in literature of it. The biggest unknown, unfortunately. So maybe with the help of you guys, people know more about it.
I mean, within the Zoroastrians and the Muslims, the Shahnameh is great. But I'm wondering, within, like, for example, the Americans don't have our culture. How known? I mean, they may know about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, but how known is it among other cultures?
Again, so it's not much known, so maybe it's our fault. Okay. So remember that. So if for something to get roots in people's basically common mind and common knowledge, it takes time. Okay. So if we talk about Ramayana and Mahabharata, so Indians throughout the ages introduced these books and these resources to others. However, Iranians were suffering throughout times. In the past 1,000 years, most of the time, they were basically beaten up and they were trying to just survive. There were so many wars and things that they could not even just focus on culture. You know about these Maslow pyramid, right? So just they were at the bottom of this. They could not dedicate anything to culture. And when, I'm going to talk about versions of Shahnameh later, that you see that the first Shahnamehs were published outside Iran. So the first one was, we know about Jolmo and Makan, so Turner and Makan in India. So these were the first few versions of Shahnameh published outside Iran. Iran was not in a shape to even just do any of these back then. So it was just very recently that we have started to promote Shahnameh. So let me just do some calculation for the date. It was in 1934, the first time that there was a big seminar on Ferdowsi and Shahnameh in Iran. It was during the Reza Shah period. So the monument that you see behind me is from that time. So it was a tomb of Ferdowsi. So it was just the first time that they really tried to promote Ferdowsi. Many, even Iranians, had not heard of Ferdowsi before that. It was just during that time that they started promoting Ferdowsi. They were the seminar, the books were published. Just one important version of Shahnameh of Burukhim was published then. And there were scholars started in courses and programs in universities started at that time. See, it was 70, 80 years ago. So it's not that long. So that's why it hasn't had the chance to go around the world. And maybe now it's not even the time anymore because people do not care as much. Twitter is just 140 or 200 characters or something. So people do not even just pay attention to these things anymore, unfortunately. And so this is something that's, again, so we're talking, so sorry for doing talking so long, but just one thing to mention. So I'm going to hopefully talk about that more later, but sometimes things have their own time. There is a window that is open, things can happen. If not, the window is closed. And Ferdowsi also used and leveraged one of those windows. If Ferdowsi lived 100 years before, or maybe 200 years later, he could not have written Shahnameh. Or if he had written, nobody had cared. Nobody cared about it. So that's why Ferdowsi was also in the right time and right place, and we are lucky about that. So same thing about here. So maybe today, so even my kids, if I want to tell them long stories about Shahnameh, so they may not even listen. All right. So, Hushan.
Yeah, just wanted to add that the image you have behind you, yeah, it is of the Ferdowsi's tomb mausoleum. And I would like everyone to Google it and view it because it's available. It's a beautiful, huge, beautiful complex now with huge gardens, and his tomb is also underground and very nicely made. And this was started by the father of the Raza Shah Pahlavi in 1934, as you said. Before
Reza
that,
Shah.
yeah.
Reza Shah himself, not
Raza
father.
Shah himself.
Yeah,
Okay.
himself, right.
Acha. And before that, Ferdowsi, for several centuries after his death, was buried in his own garden.
Yes, yes. And one interesting fact is also as well, this mausoleum, this tomb is created thanks to the Zoroastrian senator in Iran back then, Keykhosro Shahro. You may have heard of him. He was commissioned to go and do this job, and he did a lot to make this happen.
Oh,
so we
good.
really appreciate him for that.
Yeah, and the mausoleum is very, very beautiful.
It is.
All of you must Google and see it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. So yeah, it's an hour and a half. So maybe that we should set expectations as such for future lectures. Is that okay, Samirza? Can we consider that as such? I hope it's not bad. You were not bored. Some of you just woke up very early in the morning. Tomorrow it's just 8 o'clock. Come on, why are you here?
Well, you make it so interesting that people are galvanized. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, and talk to you guys.
Thank you, Afshin. Thank you, 10.